So let's begin with the word of prayer. Dear Father in heaven, we are so thankful for this new week and the opportunity to once again study together. We ask, Lord, for your Spirit to guide our hearts and minds as we continue to look at the daily, as we sort through the rubbish that has been heaped upon this truth. As we look for those precious jewels, we ask, Lord, for the dirt brush man to come in and help us. We need your understanding, Lord, and we need to correct any errors we may have. Thank you for hearing our prayer, and be with us now, we pray, in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, good morning, everyone. As we continue to study, there has been a lot of reading that I've had to do to try to sort through these things. And if you remember, Stephen was supposed to do a little bit of a write-up or something for us, which he hasn't done yet, but he's still going to help us out. And what we're really specifically looking at is 508 and trying to understand what event marked the taking away of the daily. Now, first thing I'm going to direct you to is this is on the E.G. White website, but it's Josiah Litch, and it's his what is the paper? Can't remember what that stands for. Prophetic Exposition number 2, I think is what it is. So it's on the E.G. White disc as well. Now he's going to address this taking away of the daily. And he's looking at verse 11 of chapter 12, right? So he's addressing the 1335. And he says, well, we'll just read the verse. And from the time that the daily sacrifice shall be taken away, and the abomination that maketh desolate set up, there shall be 1,290 days. So here he's addressing the 1,290 days, which also is the starting point for the 1335. From the time that the daily shall be taken away, the nature of the daily and the abomination that maketh desolate has already been discussed. Some have supposed that in order to find the date of the 1290 days in this verse, we must show that the one was taken away and the other set up at one and the same time, but it is not so. They are two distinct acts, and it is sufficient to show that the one had been taken away prior to the setting up of the other. Thus, Paul, the mystery of iniquity doth already work. Only he who now letteth will let until he be taken out of the way, and then shall that wicked be revealed. The power of paganism was broken, and the place of his sanctuary cast down and desecrated by the barbarian warriors and conquerors of Rome, especially Genseric. If it can now be shown when the last of the two events took place, that is, the abomination that maketh desolate was set up, we shall have the requisite date. The testimony has been produced from Gibbon that the first outbreak of the Catholic Church against the civil empire on a question of faith, which outbreak resulted in a war, by which the emperor was subdued and yielded, the point was in AD 508. That conquest of the church was achieved, too, by an army of idolaters in behalf of popery. Then the abomination that maketh desolate was set up. From that point, 1290 years end in 1798, the time of the end, when the saints were taken out of the hands of popery. The fulfillment of the first period demonstrates the correctness of the starting point, as the fulfillment of the 70 weeks does the date of the 2300 days. There's no uncertainty left on the point in case of either date. So what is he marking in 508?
All right, can it be said that he is marking that the outbreak of the Catholic Church against a civil power?
Yeah, so the first outbreak of the Catholic Church against the civil power of the empire on a question of faith, which outbreak resulted in war, by which the emperor was subdued and yielded the point, was in AD 508. So he's saying that basically the Catholic Church had a war against the civil power, which subdued the civil power. And this was in 508. So what is he referring to? And he says this is in Gibbon.
Only war I can think of in that time period is the battle of Clovis against the Visigoths.
Right. So if we're going to have Clovis against the Visigoths, now that date we actually have is 507 that war began. In my understanding of it, in 508. But maybe it ended in 508. But
yeah, you had a main battle in 507, and then there was like a remnants that it took a while for then the Franks to pursue after the Visigoths and drive them out of France.
Yeah, in 508. Yeah, that would be in 508. Now, so this view is that it's basically the subduing of the Visigoths. Now, the Visigoths themselves are not one of the horns that are plucked up, correct?
Yeah.
Because what are the horns? There's the Heruli,
Ostrogoths and Vandals.
Ostrogoths and Vandals, right? Now, they're going to then be plucked up in the following 30 years. Well, I guess one of them first was plucked up earlier, right?
They normally relate the Heruli being plucked up in 493.
Yeah. And then
the death of Odoacer.
Yeah, okay. So we're going to have this issue of these horns and how they relate to 538. But here in 508, we can see that Lich is taking that this is this battle. Now, the problem that I have with a lot of these interpretations of trying to figure out the date is, I mean, we have something solid in 1798. And we have lots of other ways in which the 1260 is sort of verified. But the weakness for me always has been this 508 date, mostly because there's different opinions on it. But you could almost take, any other types of years, other than the fact that they both end in 1798. In some ways, it looks like we're just cherry picking that year 508 and some event that happens, which is finally the Visigoths being driven out. Okay, so it says the 1843 chart says the Heruli were plucked up in 476.
That's not when they're plucked up. That's when they conquer Western Rome.
Okay, yeah.
That's when Odoacer becomes the king of Italy.
Okay. So that makes more sense, because that would be about the time that would have happened. And where is that on the charts?
1843. I think
Okay,
it mentions.
So it's going to be not on the main column, just somewhere.
I don't think it identifies when they're plucked up. It just says that they will be plucked up, but it identifies years.
Okay.
From when they would begin to take territory from Western Rome. A lot of the dates are like 407. You have like the crossing of the Rhine by a lot of these Gothic tribes. you have a lot of the tribes like the Burgundians and so forth being associated with that date. And then you have 377.
Oh, yeah. So what she's referring to is where it talks about the 10 kingdoms, and that's not when they're plucked up. I don't think. Here, I'm just going to look at the chart. Just hang on a second. So, yeah, these are not anything about them being plucked up. These are, because these are when they basically are marked in prophecy. The events that they come when they come against Rome itself. Now, 3 are going to be plucked up: the Ostrogoths, Vandals, and the Heruli. But that's not the years they're plucked up. So just the clarification on that point. Yeah. So go on, Stephen. What you were saying about these.
Yeah. So you have the Ostrogoths there being 377. That's when the Huns, or there was these here tribes coming in. I think it was maybe the Huns that drove them into the Western Rome. There was a battle there called the Battle of Adrianople. I think that was in 378. So that's sort of the beginning of the Western Roman Empire downfall. What's interesting is that the dates you have for the Ostrogoths, Heruli, and the Vandals, when they begin to take territory from Rome, when you add them up, the three dates associated with them 3 kingdoms adds up to 1260.
Yeah, and I think you pointed that out once before, I believe. But yeah, that's pretty interesting. Now, so the problem is here that, for me personally, is we know the 1260 is correct, and 538 and 1798 are something that are very solid, but 508 doesn't appear to be as solid. Now, there's a number of criticisms that people have. One is, why would we mark this battle as the taking away of paganism? Now the Visigoths, are they pagan still at that point, or are they Arian?
The understanding is that they were Arian.
Right. So what people argue is that, well, they've already become Christian nations of sorts. They're just not Roman Catholic. Now, in the study last time where we looked at, I guess maybe that was Wednesday, we looked at the baptism of Clovis. Now, why could we use the baptism of Clovis on December 25th, 508, as a much more solid point to mark the taking away of the daily? Why prophetically would that be more significant than a battle or the defeating of the Visigoths in 508? If we were going to take that position, what would be our arguments? We looked at
you have a state power which the Catholic Church recognizes as the firstborn daughter of the Catholic Church.
Okay.
Or something like that, some title they give to.
That's kind of what I was going to say too.
Yeah. And then there's the power of the symbol of baptism in the counterfeit nature that we see with Christ. We can see the 30 years, and with where Christ is going to be baptized when he's 30 years of age. And we can see that this period of 30 years is going to begin with the baptism. So sort of a chiastic pattern from the baptism of Christ. And baptism, what is it that we say about the papacy? What is one of the ways in which we describe the papacy in relationship to baptism?
Baptized paganism. Yeah.
It's baptized paganism, right? So we've been using this phrase that it's paganism baptized. And so we can see that in a sense is used as a symbol with Clovis. And Clovis to me has always been the symbol. Now, I used to believe, and maybe this was based upon, but something about Clovis being converted in 508, but that's what I used to believe, is that he was converted in 508. Somebody had years ago had made that statement, though it's only more modern research that has actually placed his baptism on December 25th, 508, not December 25th, 496. So I'm not sure exactly, where that came in, why people would look at Clovis's conversion. But we see these types of things, these types of points being made again and again. Now, that's not what I want to look at. That's dealing with the prophetic chart. And okay, so I had looked at Ministry Magazine. Now, Ministry Magazine from 1935. This was a series of articles in Ministry Magazine that were addressing the prophetic chronology. Now, this guy, Hoffman, I don't know who he is, B.P. Hoffman, but he definitely, in 35, we know that the church already has approached Bible prophecy much more like a Protestant would. Here, I need to switch my screen. So, there we go. So, this article here, he's going to go through the guiding principles in prophetic interpretation. And I haven't read all of the articles, but it's going to start in one issue. And then he's going to go into the next issue. It's going to be all in 3 issues. And so let me see if I can find this here quickly. Okay, so this is Principles in Prophetic Interpretation number 2. Now, he's going to address 508. Maybe I should just search the document, it might be easier. Okay, so he's going to talk here about all this history. The Visigoths were not one of the 3 horns plucked up by the little horn for this reason. After they had been defeated by Clovis in the year 508, they passed the Pyrenees, or however you say that, Pyrenees, into Spain and founded a kingdom.
Pyrenees.
Pyrenees, is that how you say it? Okay, that makes much more sense. In the year 589, 595, they renounced Arianism and became Catholic. So they're still Arian, but they're in Spain. So they are defeated in 508. In the year 711, they fought a 6-day battle with the Moors and were vanquished. Roderick, their last king, was killed in battle. This ended the Gothic monarchy in Spain. So you can see they're going to take this 508 and they're going to look at this when the Visigoths are defeated by Clovis as in 508. Now they're going to focus more here in this paper dealing with 538. And so I just want to read what it says here. Prophecy explicitly points out that this power or supremacy was given not to the Pope and the Church alone, nor to the Emperor and the state alone, but to the little horn, which is the Church and state united in one government. To illustrate, Babylon was overthrown by Medo-Persia 538 BC, which marks the date of her political supremacy. But she existed as a nation, or more accurately, nations, long before that date. Medo-Persia was overthrown by Greece in 331. And then he's going to say Greece was conquered by Rome at the Battle of Pydna in Macedon in 168 BC, which date marks her political supremacy over the Macedonian kingdom. But Rome was a nation centuries before that date. What's the date for the Battle of Pydna? We know.
June 22nd.
So that's June 22nd, right? That's what I thought. which I find interesting, being this symbol. And then he's going to go, the last three horns, the Ostrogoths surrendered their power over the Pope of Western Catholic Church through their defeat in 538 AD, although the little horn as a government had existed since the days of Constantine. So he's going to look at 538 AD. And so this is something that I think we can establish quite well, is 538 AD. Prophecy demands, in number 40, point number 40, prophecy demands that the little horn should think to change times and law. History again speaks, proving that the little horn changed the Sabbath from Saturday to Sunday between the years 321 and 500 AD, particularly in the East, prior to the prophetically allotted period of its domination beginning in 538. So he's addressing the little horn power here and all the things connected with it. 538, the church in the wilderness, the 1260 years. So fairly standard Adventist way of looking at things. Now, of course, back in 1935, you're not going to have anybody questioning the date of Clovis's baptism. But I think that's one point, at least, that we can say that it makes much more sense. Now, the question that arises is Heidi Hikes, who rejects the pioneer view of the daily, he's going to make other arguments for 508 and 538. And it's very odd that when he does so, he's going to reject the baptism of Clovis, which he's going to clearly mark in 508 as having any prophetic significance as occurring in that year. So why is Heidi Hikes going to reject December 25th, 508 as a marker? Why is he going to use his other argument? His argument has to do with legislation. So he's more concerned about legislation. But why would he reject Clovis's baptism on December 25th and 508 as a marker for the beginning of the 1290 and the 1335? Even though he accepts, what's that?
Because it's associated with taking away of paganism.
Right. So it would be associated, it would be a very good argument for us who believe that the daily is paganism. So he can't in any way have that baptism associated with it. He doesn't give a good reason why it doesn't work as a symbol, other than that he just dismisses it. So he does all these arguments to show that the baptism of Clovis happened on December 25th, 508, and then just waves his hand and says, this has nothing to do with any prophetic significance with the taking away of the daily. So, which I just find rather interesting, because it is probably the most, for me personally, the most powerful symbol that you can have is the baptism of Clovis, as we pointed out. But my other point really is that he's going to give some other event for the 1290 and the 1335, just as he's going to for the 538. He's going to give a different starting point for the 1260, or not a different date. He's going to use 538, but he's going to give different arguments of why 538 is the beginning of the 1260. He's not going to be concerned with the plucking of the horns. He doesn't consider that prophetically significant for some reason. He's going to focus on the legislation. So again, he's focused on legislation. And I don't think a lot of the things that he says about legislation is necessarily something that we could just dismiss either. I think there's probably a connection there. But he's focusing upon legislation because he's not interested in the daily being paganism. And so when he starts it in 508 as being legislation, then he has to continue to use it in 538 as the main marker for the setting up of the papacy. But if he can do that, or, I mean, I'm not saying, he can do that, and we're going to do basically the same thing. We're going to mark a different event than was marked by Miller. Miller isn't marking the baptism of Clovis. So the question is, are we doing the same thing as him? Do we have to maintain Miller's arguments for why he chooses 508 if we're going to support 508? Because if what he's doing is wrong, isn't what we're doing wrong? I guess is another way of putting it. How would we answer that objection? We're just doing the same thing he's doing. We're creating new arguments for our view because the old arguments were solid. And since they weren't solid, to find new arguments or new events is kind of disingenuous. We should just admit defeat, that Miller was wrong. Right? That would be the argument people would bring against us. How would we answer that?
Well, the Millerites didn't have the information we have that's come to light concerning 508 and the baptism of Clovis.
Okay, so they didn't have that information. And could we argue that the main point that they were focused upon was the 1260 and that the 1290 ended with the 1260? But that in some ways they had a weak argument for 508. That it wasn't maybe the best argument they could have had, but they knew they had the year 508. And of course, that's one of the commencements that Miller was given. And so if we're going to argue, well, the whole basis for his commencement was faulty, how can we argue that commencement is correct, other than that God gave it to him? Because he was given the commencement of the chain of truth. And there's 3 dates that he marks. Right, 457, 677, 457, and 508.
Well, the fact that God gave it to him should have some weight.
Yeah, but we also have other examples of this. Josiah Litch, when he makes his argument for August 11th, 1840, he doesn't take into account the difference between the Julian and the Gregorian calendars. Now, there's different ways he could have done it. That's one of the problems. And I've done a study on where I showed that if he's going to, is he going to start with the Gregorian calendar and follow that all the way through? Is he going to, do the conversion at the beginning that would be, or is he going to wait till the end and just add on the 12 days? I mean, some people would just say he should even been 10 days, right? So there's all these different ways in which he could have done it, but he chose the correct way without even knowing it. That is, if you follow the biblical calendar, the 26th day of the 4th month is July 27th Julian in 1299. And the 26th day of the 4th month is July 27th Gregorian in 1840. So if he had just used the biblical calendar, he would have come to the correct date. Now, so this is an example where God has guided his people prophetically, even though they may not have made the best arguments to come to that conclusion. But he does it, for what reason did he do it with Josiah Litch from our perspective? What was the reason that God guided Josiah Litch in that way?
Well, eventually it was to empower the first angel's message.
Okay, so it empowered the first angel's message. And then when we find from a further study, an examination of Josiah Litch's prophecy, and we then recognize that the 26th day of the 4th month is a symbol, would God have allowed him not to see that so that we could see it?
That's possible.
Yeah, to me, this is is one of the things that I found as I continued my study on chronology in the Bible and prophecy, is that we kept finding things that had been missed. And I believed all along that that was in God's providence, that in a sense, he kept hiding these things for us to find. I mean, there was no way else I could explain how we could find so many things that had been hidden right in front of people's eyes if they had taken the time to look. Now, some of the things, of course, was accepting the 2520 unlocked those things. But I mean, I could just go down a list, the things that happened in 457, the dates in Ezekiel, and how they're connected to Samuel Snow's letters and Millerite history and the different chiasms and structures. All these different things were hidden, and we find them. So could we make the argument regarding December 25th, 508, that this is something that God has given us to help to establish that which was given in the past? That is, it's an examination of the foundation where we can see that the foundation was laid correctly, almost in spite of the fact that those who laid that foundation had little idea of what they were doing. They were just following God's direction. So could we make that argument?
Well, it's really amazing. They could miss some steps and still hit on the target.
Well, that's the thing, you know. And this just doesn't happen once or twice. This continually happens. Time and time again, they get the right answer, but with the wrong reason. The best example of this is October 22nd, 1844. If you look at the Millerite writings, they believe that they're using the Karaite calendar. And they have this understanding or this belief that the Karaites always began the year 1 month later than the rabbis. So the rabbinic Jews, in their mind, always had the Passover 1 month before the Karaites did. And so they believed that even in 1843, that the Karaite calendar would have begun a month later than the Jews. Of course, they began the same time as the Jews in 1843, as they did also in 1844. Now, this has created a lot of confusion for Adventists, because many Adventists, believe that somehow we were following the Karaite calendar in 1844. And that can be easily shown that we weren't, because the Karaites never would have started the year that late. They only start 1 month later, when the rabbinic Jews started quite early in March. And then they're going to start it a month later. But they never ever would start the year on April 19th. So the Karaites didn't do that in 1844. And we know that because of the gravestones of Karaite Jews. They put the dates of what it is on the biblical calendar and what it is on the Gregorian or Julian calendar, depending where they were. I think it's actually the Julian, because that was in Russia that we had a lot of these Karaite Jews. But the point is, we have this misunderstanding about October 22nd. Now, it wasn't just that. So the other point is that the Millerites also believed that you had to observe the new moon every month to determine the date for that month, when that month begins. So they didn't start on April 19th and just count 30, 29, 30, 29, 30, 29 to get to the first day of the 7th month. Now, does anybody know how they determined which was the first day of the 7th month? Because Snow didn't know when he proclaimed the message in Boston, or actually even in Exeter. He didn't actually have the date for when the 10th day of the 7th month was going to be. He just knew that it was the biblical 10th day of the 7th month. He hadn't worked it out to what date that was on the Gregorian calendar. But does anyone know how they determined the 22nd of October? What new moon did they look at and from which location on the planet?
Wasn't it from Boston?
So it was from Boston. Now, so they used the new moon in Boston. Now, if they had used the new moon in Jerusalem, they would have chosen October 23rd. But in Boston, you can actually see the new moon. I guess it's the night of the 12th. So the 13th becomes the first day of the 7th month, making the 22nd the 10th day of the 7th month. But that isn't the case in Jerusalem. You wouldn't have actually seen the new moon until the evening of the 13th, making the 14th, the first of 14, 15, 16. So 20, yeah. So that's how it works out. Now, this becomes an important point. Now, why do they choose Boston and not Jerusalem?
Boston and Jerusalem, aren't they basically still in the same hemisphere?
Well, they're in the same hemisphere, but you're going to have, I think it's 7 hours difference between the two.
Right, but in the situation, they would not have been able to use Jerusalem because at that point, how would they have been able to see the moon or the new moon coming?
Okay, so now they did have charts, so there were books available that could tell you, based on mathematical calculations, when the new moon would be seen in Jerusalem, if the conditions were good, right? So they could have used those books. So they did know, and they did have access to those books, and they did use them initially. But they chose Boston prophetically, because Boston was, to them, it was sort of like the capital, even though I think Washington, D.C. is the capital by then. But it was just the capital of their movement, of how they looked at Boston, prophetically, being the land, the wilderness that helped the woman, right, who fled into the wilderness. So they look at Boston and they just choose Boston. Maybe it's somewhat arbitrary to do so, but that's what they decided to do. Now, of course, seeing the new moon to start the 7th month isn't really correct. You would actually have to count from the first day of the first month, and the 187th day would then be the 10th day of the 7th month. Now, so even when we look at the first day of the first month, though, we have to look at it from the perspective of Boston as well, right? So they're going to look at the first day of the first month based on Boston. They're going to look at the first day of the 7th month based as Boston. Now, there is an argument out there that October 23rd should have been the correct date if we had used Jerusalem. And there's a number of different arguments, and this goes back to what's her name? The one the lunar Sabbatarians use. I just can't think of her name offhand.
Grace Amadon? No.
Yeah, Grace Amadon, right? So Grace Amadon, she makes an argument, and this is how she puts Jesus' crucifixion on April 27th, 31 AD. She makes an argument that the Passover is always going to be after a full moon. The day after the full moon is recognized is the Passover, that you can't have a Passover before the full moon. And in 31 AD, that would put the Passover on Friday, because the full moon is going to occur on Thursday. And that's one of the ways in which we try to argue that Jesus Christ was crucified in 31 AD. I know it's a rather complicated argument, but if you looked at 1844 and you use that same criteria, you would actually have to start the first day of the first month on April 20th, and that would make October 23rd, the 10th day of the 7th month. Now, so you can see that there's this great deal of difficulty that they're going to have in trying to determine this calendar. Now, we are arguing that October 22nd is the correct date, but it's not using the same method that was used in the time of Christ, if Grace Amadon is correct. But there is an interesting observation that's been made. So if the 23rd was the correct Day of Atonement, when would the high priest have moved from the holy to the most holy place based upon Jerusalem time? If you understand what I'm asking. So we're 7 hours difference. You have in the morning, you have Hiram Etzin seeing this vision of Christ moving from the holy to the most holy. So one is, when is Hiram Etzin seeing Christ moving from the holy to the most holy? Is it on the 23rd? Or the 22nd, pardon me.
No, he's seeing it on the 23rd.
He's seeing it on the 23rd. Okay, so this is an interesting point. He sees it on the 23rd, but would it not have happened on the 22nd, the day before?
I would think yes.
Yeah, so we would think yes. Now, so there is an argument out there, and I'm not saying that I accept this argument fully, but it is intriguing that the time that he would have seen this occurring, if the 23rd had been the 10th day of the 7th month, this would have been the time in Jerusalem in which the high priest would have moved from the holy place to the most holy place. So this is an argument. Some people have this view.
So
Now,
you have,
yeah,
this is in the morning time,
right,
Harold Medson's. So
Right.
at that their time, it's going to be away in the afternoon.
right. So that the high priest is not going to be moving from the holy to the most holy until the afternoon of the Day of Atonement, because he has a bunch of work to do throughout that day. And some people even argue that it would be like 3 in the afternoon, that he would begin his work in the most holy place. Right. So this would line up with Hiram Edson's vision in the morning as he's walking through the cornfield. Now, I'm not saying that I accept that view. I'm just saying that it is an interesting perspective. But the one thing I can say that
Sounds kind of logical.
yeah, well, the one thing I can say that about this, so here you have God's people, and they're going to go through this experience, and they're going to come up with which day is the 10th day of the 7th month. Now, I believe that God is guiding them in that, so that the symbols are going to line up correctly. But I would make an argument that what's happening in heaven when Christ is moving from the holy to the most holy is when Hiram Etzin sees it. And that if they had used Jerusalem, they would have come up with the 23rd. So I'm kind of buying into the argument a bit, but I still think that we would mark the 10th day of the 7th month as October 22nd, not October 23rd. But yet, what we're seeing happening in heaven is happening in accordance with another timetable that's going to line up with Hiram Etzin seeing Christ moving from the holy to the most holy. Because we don't really have anything happening in Jerusalem. There's no temple there. But God is going to have this, in a sense, almost a double calendar. Now, some people would have a hard time with that, and I'm not going to be adamant about it. But it is extremely intriguing, because if we were going to use the same method for determining the 10th day of the 7th month and the first day of the first month and the Passover and so forth in 1844, as Grace Amadon says they used in 31 AD, we would have had to move everything one day later. But that wasn't the experience of the Millerites. And what matters, even if the Millerites had chosen, let's say, September 23rd, because they just used the Jewish rabbinic calendar. That would have been the Day of Atonement. You understand what I'm saying? It wasn't like they had to get the right day per se for that to happen, because their experience was tied up with what was happening in heaven. Does that make sense to people, or do you think I'm kind of stretching it a bit?
Well, we would like to be able to harmonize that.
Well, we know that there is, in a sense, a bit of an arbitrariness to determining a calendar based upon the moon and the sun that always has existed. That is, if it's by observation, well, it depends who's observing it. Depends how they determine, because when you go back and you try to figure out which, you can't be 100% certain in any given year that the Jews actually observed the new moon at such and such a date. You just can't know, because you don't know the weather conditions. And this is why, some people say, well, the full moon is used because then they can observe the full moon. And they just are always going to start, and they can determine that by observing the moon, they can observe the anomaly of the moon. This is Grace Hammond's argument. And so they don't really need to see the first visible crescent at the last day of the year. They can determine this because they know when the full moon's going to occur. But there still is a bit of arbitrariness to it. There's human error and observation. So it doesn't mean that there has to be a specific date, because some people argue, well, you got the wrong date. It should have been October 23rd. So that totally discounts the whole Millerite, 7th month movement, because they got the wrong date to begin with. Or some will say, well, it should have been September 23rd or something. But my point is that God has been guiding the movement, even in the things that they don't fully understand. He's guiding them prophetically. And now what we're doing is, here we are at the end of the world looking back, and we can see clearly that God led them in their decisions. So in 508, it doesn't mean that they had to have the right reason, but, or the right event, but they had to have a basis that was prophetic. And the basis that is immovable is that the daily is paganism, and the abomination of desolation is papalism, or the transgression of desolation is papalism, correct? That we can't change, because if we change that, we're not just changing some event or some detail, we're actually changing the whole basis of that prophecy. Its prophetic symbolism, what it means. And so when somebody like Heidi Hikes goes back and says, well, I'm going to keep those dates, 508 and 538, but I'm going to reject the view that the daily or paganism had anything to do with it, and that the daily is Christ's heavenly ministry, that then we run into this bigger problem, because the two desolating powers and all this connection to Daniel 8 and the 2300 days, all those things are undermined to the point where people who did see the new view of the daily recognized this and rejected Adventism, or rejected the 2300 days. So I understand it's a problem in some ways, because we go back and we see now some new event that they never saw, but we're not rejecting any of their principles. In fact, it agrees with the principles and with their interpretation of prophecy. That is, if they had seen that the baptism of Clovis was on December 25th, 508, not 496, I think they would have chosen that as the event that marked the end or the taking away of paganism. And it would have been more powerful. So these weaknesses that existed, if you want to call them weaknesses, in some of their arguments, and we've seen this, some of the ways that they looked at Daniel 11 verse 40 to 45, or Daniel 11 verse 46 to 45, and then also the way that they looked at Josiah Litch's prophecy, Revelation 9. There's some weaknesses there. There's things that they didn't notice. We're not, by correcting them or by seeing things that they never saw, we aren't rejecting their message, we're actually taking that old light and it's shining brighter than it did before by our examination and recognition of these details that they never noticed. Would we agree with that?
Amen.
Okay. You know, and I've been thinking about, Dwight's sermon this yesterday, the two presentations, and this whole thing about this message becoming united, that we have to come in unity to what our message is going to be, and that we're going to become united in giving that message, and that's going to be by December 25th. And of course, the powerful symbol there of 508 with December 25th, I think is remarkable, because for us to find that date, it becomes even more significant than if it was found earlier. But the other thing is, I keep trying to wonder, what is it that's going to bring about this unity? And I really believe it's the examination of the foundation that we're doing right now. That in order for this movement to become united, we have to become united upon this platform.
One of the things that came up last night, I received a telephone call from someone that did not log into any of the meetings, did not log on to what had been said yesterday.
Okay.
One of the things that I greatly appreciate about these studies and about those that are attending these in the morning, but also that are choosing to watch these later, is that we have been able and willing to ask questions, to also give input of what's going on. Now, this call last night is giving me a lot of reasons to pay attention, but to study more on what we're talking about, because there's a party that is very vocal about the validity of the charts. And this party right now is presenting on Jonah, but his take is that Jonah is a symbol for the church and not for the movement. His belief is that the church was thrown overboard, that the church is going to give a message that is going to evangelize the entire world. And what we're seeing from these studies here is it is a very small group that came to understand the validity of the 1843 chart of 508, 538, 677, and that prophetic chain of truth. So what is concerning me is I know where this other person has been speaking, and there are many friends that may be listening and some that could be trying to accept what this guy is saying because he has the charts behind him. This is not a unity situation, because honestly, the church is setting aside the charts. Now, this could be the adversary's next move to try to get some that have been in the movement, some that have been using the charts, to basically reject the history and reject the foundations.
Okay. So the person phoned you, what did they specifically say that you talked to last night?
Well, this party that has been using the charts.
Yeah.
some of us would have him as a friend on Facebook because he goes with the nom de plume of William Miller. That's
Okay.
not his real name.
So I know who it is.
Well, he's now promoting that the book of Jonah is representative of the corporate church.
Hmm.
And quite honestly, as I have been led to present, I see this as representative of the movement and not of the corporate church.
Hmm.
Because the messages that have been given prior to 1844 and between 1844 and 1863 have basically been completely set aside by the corporate church, just like the message of 1888 was set aside by the church.
Uh-huh. Yeah, so I mean, I would agree with you. I do know that this movement is typical of what's going to happen within Adventism, but I wouldn't call it corporate Adventism. I would say that this really would more refer to, the Levites, those that are going to end up, I'm just trying to get this set up, those that are going to end up receiving this message. It's not going to be the corporate Adventists, the church, and in that sense, that's going to be accepting this message and giving the loud cry. So there is a sense in which this movement is kind of typical of what's going to happen. But I would say that you would have to apply Jonah primarily to July 18th and that prediction, because our failed prediction is what is parallel to October 22nd in that context.
Exactly.
Yeah. So thanks for that that information. Now, what I'm going to look at next is Loughborough. Now, the reason why I'm looking at Loughborough here is that he's referred to by Heidi Hikes and by Dennis Kaiser, supporting the idea that the Ellen G. White's statement in Early Writings, page 74, where it talks about the daily and time, is not going to be a test again, is that there was time setting in connection with the daily. Now, one of the things I did is I looked into detail to these statements. So there was this article, which is, and we're also going to look at Crozier's paper here right away too. So we're probably not going to get very far there. But we had looked at this article where they had been talking about the daily and that the word sacrifice being added represented the truth. Now, this was an article from the Advent Herald of March, was March 3rd, 1849. And there was nothing in that whole series of articles that had anything to do with time setting. That is, they used this article to say that time setting is being connected with this new interpretation of the daily. And yet the source that they give doesn't say that. And then they give this other person who is setting dates in 1854 that Ellen White, of course, could not have been referring to in 1850, who isn't actually, from what I can see, connected with the Millerite movement at that time. So that is, Millerites aren't following him. He is somebody who was a Millerite. But he's now on his own. But I also don't see that there's any connection between his interpretation that the word sacrifice should be there and his time setting. That is, he makes arguments that the daily sacrifice being taken away is 70 AD, but that has nothing to do with his dates. So there's no connection between the idea of this new view of the daily or different views of the daily, that they're in any way connected to time setting. They do bring darkness and confusion, but not because they're attached to dates. Now, the third bit of evidence they present is Loughborough. Now, this is an article that Loughborough wrote in 1907. This is in the Advent Review and Sabbath Herald, April 4th, 1907. And it's an article called The 1335 Days. And they quote from this article as evidence that early writings is referring to time setting in connection with the daily, because this is what Loughborough says. Now, Loughborough isn't one of the pioneers. He didn't go through Millerite history. He's not there in 1850 in their study or anything like that. He's a bit later. I can't remember exactly where we would place him. But he is one that knew Ellen White, and often he's considered a pioneer by many people because they don't understand what a pioneer is. They put Jones and Wagner as pioneers as well, which I wouldn't. So he's going to quote Daniel 12, verse 11 to 13. In the above language, there is presented to us a reckoning of time from one event to another. The first is called the taking away of the daily sacrifice. The last is the end of the days. This end of the days, prophetic days, must be the end of the 12 or the 2300 days, for that period comes down the farthest of any of the periods mentioned to Daniel, reaching to October 22, 1844. So when we came to that point of time, it could be said truthfully, the end of the days. It was then that we came to the antitype of the cleansing of the sanctuary in the Jewish service, when the lot was cast upon the two goats. So he's going to deal here a bit with the Day of Atonement. And this isn't really pertinent to his whole discussion, so I'm not sure why he's presenting it, other than that he's talking about the taking away of the daily. Now, as we see what event marks the close of time reckoning of Daniel, chapter 12, is it proper to inquire what event marked the beginning of the reckoning? It seems from the language used that it is the definite date from which time could be reckoned, for it says, from the time the daily shall be taken away, showing clearly that it is some event that is so definite that one can reckon time from it. Thus, we are brought directly to the question, what is meant by the term daily sacrifice, and what is meant by the taking away of the daily? And here's the part that they like to quote. In early writings, page 74, we read, I saw in relation to the daily, Daniel 8:12, that the word sacrifice was supplied by man's wisdom and does not belong to the text, and that the Lord gave the correct view of it to those who gave the judgment outcry. When union existed before 1844, nearly all were united on the correct view of the daily. But in the confusion since 1844, other views have been embraced and darkness and confusion have followed. On the same page we read, I've seen that the 1843 chart was directed by the hand of the Lord, and that it should not be altered, and that the figures were as he wanted them, that his hand was over and hid a mistake in some of the figures so that none could see it until his hand was removed. This mistake related to the supposition that the 2300 days ended in the spring of 1844 instead of the 10th day of the 7th month, October 22, 1844, as was afterward clearly demonstrated. In the view of the above statements in early writings, many letters have been written to me inquiring, what was the position taken on the daily by those who gave the message prior to and during 1844? My reply is this. They claimed that the word sacrifice was a supplied word, and that the word daily meant continual and referred to that which had continually all along warred against the work of God, and that it was paganism. They said this is something that hindered and set up granting of civil power to the papacy. They connected this text to Daniel with Paul's statement in 2 Thessalonians 2 verse 7 and 8. For the mystery of iniquity doth already work. Only he who now hindereth, will let or hinder, until he be taken out of the way, and then shall that wicked be revealed. Continuing, they reasoned thus. Paganism was the religion of the Roman Empire, established by the law of the empire. The papacy could not get that power while it was held by paganism. In 508, the pagan religion was abolished as the religion of the empire. Now he that hindered was taken out of the way, and that wicked, the papacy, could be set up. Now you're going to see here, he's going to say pagan religion was abolished as the religion of the empire in 508. I'm not sure necessarily that you could just take that date and say that that's when pagan religion was abolished, but we have the baptism of Clovis, which would definitely be an event that we could mark. On the chart, which early writings declares was correct, and especially states that it was correct in the interpretation of the daily, we have a column of time reckoning which reads, and I quote from one of those charts which lies before me, 508, taking away of the daily sacrifice, Daniel 12, verse 11 and 12. Again, 538, the Heruli, Vandals, and Ostrogoths by this time were plucked up. This is the prophetic period for the rise of the little horn. See Daniel 7 to 8. 3 horns plucked up, and the little horn rises, which is the commencement of the papal power, the commencement of the times and a half, or 1260 years, terminating in 1798. A little farther down the column, we read the 1290 years, Daniel 12:11, commencing 508. At the taking away of the daily sacrifice, terminate 1798, from which period 45 years completes 1335 years, when Daniel is to stand in his lot at the end of the days. The 1335 from the taking away of the daily, 508, and the 45 from the close of the 1290 terminate together in 1843. Bear in mind that the 1843 occurring frequently on the chart was the 1843 Jewish reckoning, which they suppose to be of April 1844 of our reckoning of time. That which was discovered when the hand of God was removed was that the periods, especially the 2300 days, terminated October 22, 1844, which was the 10th day of the 7th Jewish month of that year, instead of April, the close of the Jewish 1843. So here's, I think this is the paragraph that they quote. The confusion that came in after the termination of the 2300 days was first among those who persisted in setting times for the Lord to come. They claimed that the daily sacrifice meant the Jewish daily offerings. That certainly made confusion in what were the clear views before. As we have seen, the taking away of the daily is a definite point of time from which the 1290 and the 1335 days, etc., could be computed. The Jewish sacrifices met their antitypical object when Christ expired on the cross, the true offerings for the sin of mankind, and when the veil of the temple was rent in twain from the top to the bottom, Matthew 27:51. Those who came in with this confusion found no event to which either the 1290 or the 1335 years would reach. Beginning them at the crucifixion of Christ, neither did they attempt it. So in 1907, why is Loughborough giving this interpretation of what was happening in early Millerite history? Is this his personal experience or understanding?
I think he's trying to give a defense to some of the things that Conradi was promoting.
Right. Now, is he buying into what they're saying about that the daily, these different views are connected with time setting? So is he really just conceding the point more than anything, but then trying to use it and argue his point from that? You understand what I'm saying? Because he doesn't have personal knowledge that people were using the daily for time setting. In fact, he's saying here that, well, once you put it in the cross, or if you put it in 70 AD, that's not going to, the 1335 is not going to come to some future date from 1844. So they didn't even try to attempt it, he says. But one of the things that I could not find is any evidence that people were using this reinterpretation of the daily as daily sacrifice in time setting. That is, maybe it exists somewhere, but I can't find it. And neither could they, because they don't give any examples of it. Instead, they do some sleight of hand. They present some people who are saying that the word sacrifice should be added to the text, but those people aren't time setting. And then they show some people who are time setting, but those people are after Ellen White's period. And then they use Loughborough's statements here, but Loughborough isn't making their argument, even though he is accepting their premise that the statement in early writings is addressing time setting in connection with different views of the daily. Now, he's trying to argue here, though, that Ellen White's correct. We can't have a different view of the daily, and that's going to cause confusion. But yet, so you can see there is confusion. The new view says, well, we accept that the word sacrifice is not added or is added to the text. On the one hand, right, they're accepting that, right? But they also, on the other hand, aren't accepting it. They're not being straight up and honest. They're just making an argument to win a debate, so that they can confuse the issue. So taking Loughborough here, to me, isn't really fair. Next, they say the taking away of the daily was at the destruction of Jerusalem, the complete overthrow of the Jewish sacrifices, AD 70. Adding the other periods to AD 70 did not bring conclusions any more clear than the previous confusion of the dates. So we can see here that this isn't going to solve their problem. And I have to get to the next page. Still later, the position was taken that the daily which was taken away referred to the continual offering of Christ in our behalf. And we might inquire, if the offering of Christ is to be a continual offering for the gospel age, when was it ever taken away, seeing he ever liveth to make intercession for us? Hebrews 7-25. Those reasoning from the premise said, the papacy could not come to its ascendancy and enforce the doctrine of the intercession of the Virgin Mary and all the saints, until in the minds of the people they had led them away from the real virtue of Christ's offering in their behalf. So this brings up a number of points. Now, when he's talking about this later position, which position is he talking about? Where the daily is Christ's continual offering.
The one that began to be promoted about 1901.
Right. So he's taking Conradi's view, and he's saying, this is another view, okay? So he's definitely arguing against what the new view is, and yet they're going to use him because of what he says, taken out of context, that he's supporting the idea that the daily was used in connection with time setting. Yet he has no personal knowledge of this. It's just something that he has basically accepted their position on early writing 74 in that regard. So he doesn't have some insight. He's not a primary source. And it's really deceptive to use Loughborough when he's arguing against them as support for them. Right? He's arguing against their view. He's not on their side. And yet they're going to use him because of what he says, taking it out of context so that it looks like they have evidence for time setting in connection with the daily, because that's what they have to argue, that the correct view of the daily had nothing to do with paganism. It had to do with just the fact that the word sacrifice was added by man's wisdom. And yet, you're going to see many of them even reject that. So, people who have the new view of the daily. We saw that with Ford. So you're going to see that there's kind of a mess here that's happening. Now, I want to address, so there's a few different points that we need to address here in relationship to this. Now, we're going to spend a bit more time tomorrow looking at the Daystar article by Crozier. But one of the things we will see in Crozier's article is that he doesn't anywhere come close to accepting the new view of the daily or presenting anything even remotely similar to it. The only argument that he's going to make is that Christ has a daily ministry and a yearly ministry, or the high priest does, and that Christ also has a daily and a yearly ministry. But in no way is he suggesting that this daily ministry is what's taken away. So we're gonna look at that. We're gonna look at how Kaiser tries to use, and we already did a little bit, but how he tries to use Crozier's view as the new view that was then reject it. So we're gonna look at that in a bit more detail. Now, the other point is, if the daily is taken away by the papacy, when would we have to count? When would we count that? If we're going to say that the papacy is taking away the daily and the daily was Christ's heavenly ministry, when would Christ's heavenly ministry have to have been obscured or taken away by the papacy in order for it to be
I
taken
just
away?
use the general date of about 200 AD.
Okay, so I looked into this idea of when, because what we're arguing is that the taking away of the daily is the sacrifice of the Mass, right? That's the view. If you're going to talk about the taking away of the daily, and you're going to say what thing is it that takes away the daily, you definitely couldn't say it has something to do with legislation, as Heidi Hikes tries to argue, because he's going to put that in 508 and just has to do with legislation. We would say it's the system of the Mass, right? The sacrifice of the Mass is the thing that is the counterfeit of Christ's heavenly sanctuary ministry. And so what you would have to determine is, when did the Catholic Mass begin? Now, I assume that it would probably have been earlier, but it's actually much, much, much later. That is, the Catholic Mass is not something that they had from the beginning. Now, of course, it'll all depend what you mean by the Catholic Mass. So anybody do any research on when the Catholic Mass began?
I had not yet, but
Okay, so you're going to find lots of different views on how they look at it. It definitely didn't exist in its present form, but some people say it's by the beginning of the 8th century that the private Mass evolved in the monasteries of Northern Europe. So this is something that's a Northern Europe situation. And by the 11th century, after the Great Missionary Age, the growing monasteries of Northern Europe continued to ordain their monks. So the number of priests eventually far exceeded the sacramental needs of the monks. Thus, the practice of private daily celebration of Mass grew by the 12th century. Now, it says by the 6th century, parts of the Mass were relatively fixed. So it obviously had existed before. But we couldn't just say, in 508, in any way, in any of my research, I couldn't find a single reference to something about the Catholic Mass beginning in 508. So if the Catholic Mass is connected with the taking away of the daily, which it would have to be if you're saying that it's Christ's heavenly ministry that's obscured, there would be nothing in 508 that would indicate that there's any change in 508 regarding the Mass. There just isn't. So the Mass is something that develops. It, what we call the Mass, is much, much later.
I used to refer to the use of the confessional,
Yeah, well,
and the absolution of sins.
yeah, but that would again be later, right? So part of the problem that we have with Catholicism is we see it sort of as beginning, in the Roman period, and it's always been the same. But it is slowly developed and changed through the centuries. So things like the confessional weren't early on in the Catholic Church. Even, the baptism of infants, that's something that comes much later. Originally, you were baptized in a baptistry, just like we would as Adventists. So these developments of what became what we would call normally Roman Catholic practices, these developed over a long period of time. But definitely we can't see 508 as a date that would be the taking away of the daily by the Catholic Mass as being in 508. There just isn't any indication of it. So So this becomes a problem with the new view of the daily. It wants to have the daily be Christ's heavenly ministry, but to try to attach it to the dates that Miller was given, we just can't do that. But if we look at what's prophetically represented, so this is, this to me is the real issue, is we have the prophecy of the Bible and it's describing something. And we're not just arbitrarily choosing what it's describing. We're looking at this prophetically. And when we look at Daniel chapter 8, it's talking about the counterfeit. It's not talking about the real. And that counterfeit is what is being addressed. That taking away of the daily is the counterfeit of the earthly. The transgression of desolation is the counterfeit of the heavenly. And it's being set up as a persecutory power, because this is about the persecution that happens under these powers. So as we go through this, and we're going to again look at Daniel chapter 8, we'll start to see why Daniel chapter 8 says what it says. It is just this problem that we have accepted some arguments as Seventh-day Adventists about prophecy that really are not established on Miller's rules. And we've kind of mixed them in. Now, an example of this is, I keep getting lots of different comments from different people. People send me emails, they send me studies, they post things on the 2520 study group, they send me messages by messenger, put stuff on WhatsApp. And we're seeing lots of different types of use of numbers and use of prophecy and trying to look at events. But if we want to really be founded in this movement, we have to go back to the beginning and understand how to do prophecy properly. Now, I know that Parminder and Tabel and those people brought in this idea of methodology, but there's nothing wrong with understanding methodology. Miller's rules are methodology. It's just, I rather just call them Miller's rules. Methodology now kind of has become a dirty word. But when we look at Miller's rules, he's telling us and showing us from the Bible how to study the Bible. And we need to get rid of the ways in which we've looked at symbols and interpretations, because we keep mixing figurative and literal. I'm not saying that we're personally doing that, but I think in many of the people's approach to what's happening and how we're interpreting what's coming in the future is we haven't understood how to apply Miller's rules correctly. We haven't really looked at them. And we're going to look at Miller's rules in more detail as we go through the study of the foundation of this movement. So what we summed up is that there was no time setting that we can find, or that the people who are the proponents of the new view can find, for Ellen White's statement to be interpreted as the correct view of the daily is merely just that the word sacrifice is added by man's wisdom, and that it's something else, and that these reinterpretations, this darkness and confusion she's talking about, is time setting in connection with these new views of the daily, or different views of the daily. And we can't find any evidence that there is time setting connected with the daily. So it takes away one of their arguments. And we also have shown, of course, that all of those statements, the references to the 43 chart, the references to the daily, the references to time setting, the references to Sister Minor, these are all addressing the making of the new 1850 chart, either the truths that are to be on it or not on it, and also the means and the funds that are being taken away by people like Sister Minor and her followers going to Old Jerusalem. So early writings, page 74, has to be understood differently than it's being understood by the church at the present time and by the proponents of the new view of the daily. We also can see that 508 is now we found more life for it that fits our idea that paganism is what the daily is talking about, and that it being taken away by the baptism of Clovis on December 25th becomes an extremely powerful symbol, especially when you consider where we are in this time in this movement, approaching December 25th, 2021. So those are the things that we're still going to keep looking at, because Stephen's going to give us the information that we need to really establish 508 and 538. So he's going to somehow get that study together for us. We're going to look tomorrow. We're going to look at what is said in the Daystar Extra by Crozier. So we're going to look at that in more detail and see that he doesn't present the new view of the daily, and that Kaiser's paper that tries to imply that he does is just more of this propaganda for the new view of the daily. The other point I think I wanted to address, while looking at Kaiser's paper, we're going to see, I want to look at some other things where people try to how different people look at Crozier's views. So there's some other papers that we're going to look at as well. So there are a lot of things that we have to sort out, but I feel that we are sorting them out. The people who are following this, I think, are getting a much better grasp of these issues. Anybody have any comments or any questions?
I don't see many questions at this moment. I'm going to do my own personal search on this, about this, as you were asking, on the history of the Mass, because there are some Catholic authors that would claim that the Mass began at the time of the Last Supper, which would place it in 31 AD.
Right. Yeah, that's just Catholic propaganda. I mean,
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, but yeah, they would say it would be then. But
I think I was taught that at Catholic school, if I recall correctly.
And then the other part that I was looking at is that they were saying that it was formalized by their Pope Gregory, which would have been somewhere from about 490 to right about 500.
Okay, so before 508.
Right. So some of this I'll take a look into. I've got a web page up here right now on the short history of the Roman Mass.
And I found all kinds of conflicting information too regarding it. But the one thing I couldn't find is somebody nailing down that the Mass starts in 508 AD. You know, that argument's not being made even by the new proponents of the daily.
Right.
The proponents of the new view of the daily. They're not making that argument because they wouldn't have anything to market. If they did, I mean, they would surely show us. But they're going to connect it with other things. So, you know, I find it interesting when people try to it's always easy to sort of tear down an argument. I mean, to bring doubts to an argument, especially if maybe the argument isn't well formed or there's uncertainty about certain aspects of it. But to actually build up then a solid argument of your own that doesn't have any loose ends or weak legs that can be just knocked out is much more difficult. And so the new view of the daily, as far as I can see, has way more problems than any supposed problems of the old pioneer view of the daily. So,
no disagreement on that point.
Okay, so let's close with prayer. Dear Father in heaven, we thank you again for the time that we have and for the way that you lead in these studies. We know, Lord, that we have much personal work to do. And we just ask that you can be with each person in their time with you in prayer and study. And we ask your angels to watch over each one, to care for us and to preserve us. Thank you for hearing our prayer and for the gift of your Spirit. And we pray and thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.